This video is brought to you by PedalCard. What's up guys, Jared here. Today we're going to talk about remakes, or a socially sanctioned form of collective deja vu. Remakes get a whole lot of flack for being uncreative money grabs without an ounce of artistic justification. And sometimes they are just that. But other times, remakes can be monumentally inventive, deviously effective, or just plain socially relevant. And other times, we get this.
Use your big boy voice.
So what makes a remake great? And perhaps more importantly, what makes a remake suck? We have a few thoughts, and a lot of them have to do with ragging on shitty Disney live-action remakes, so don't pretend you're not up for that. Anyway, welcome to this Wisecrack edition on remakes. And, of course, spoilers ahead for movies you first watched in diapers. But before we get into it, I want to give a shout out to this week's sponsor, PedalCard. PedalCard is a card that helps you build your credit if you're just starting out. In fact, you can qualify even if you've never had credit in the past, which is great because having a good score is important if you ever want to own something like a car or a house. Pedal has partnered with WebBank, a member of the FDIC, to provide people with no credit history access to a Visa credit card. Their variable APRs range from 15.24% to 26.24%. Pedal's cashback grows with you. You can earn 1% cashback right away and up to 1.5% cashback when you make 12 monthly on-time payments. There's no annual fees, late payment fees, foreign transaction fees, or any other kind of fee. Pedal's mobile app is designed to help people spend responsibly, which may help them build their credit score. So check out PedalCard by going to pedalcard.com/wisecrack. That's pedal with a T, PETAL card.com/wisecrack to find out more. And now, back to the show. We may mistakenly think of remakes as a purely modern phenomenon, born out of some lack of imagination in which film executives can only sadly paw around their archives for old IP material to exploit. But that's not quite true. Remakes in literature and music are pretty much as old as the mediums themselves. Take the German legend of Faust, about a totally reasonable dude who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge, fun, and presumably a lifetime supply of cheese. I mean, what could go wrong? Anyways, over the past 4 centuries, his story has inspired an incredible amount of literature, ballets, operas, plays, and more. Each one was a kind of remake, even if it didn't come complete with a promotional McDonald's Happy Meal. In another example, Dies Irae, an old Gregorian chant that's been haunting dreams since at least the 13th century, eventually got reincarnated into pieces by composers like Mozart, Liszt, and Berlioz, then later into jazz, metal, and so on. Given art's history of borrowing from and building on the work of its ancestors, it's no surprise that the young art of cinema has been all about remakes since its very infancy. See, the earliest movies were, as you probably know, printed on film reels. These reels, subjected to light and mishandling by pimply theater operators, inevitably started to decay. So the earliest remakes were actually attempts to replicate old films before they were lost to the sands of time. Since then, remakes have tended to flourish in eras of economic strife and anxiety. For instance, remakes like The Island of Lost Souls and Huckleberry Finn kept the movie business humming along during the Great Depression. Remakes also tend to get a boost during times of technological change. Take, for example, the 1980s, an era where Americans spent half their time rewinding VHS tapes instead of going to movie theaters. Desperate studio executives went through a remake frenzy as they tried to get butts in seats. Today, those changes are mirrored by the digital streaming revolution, which has led many of us to prefer a good Netflix and chill sesh over shilling out $20 at our local AMC. So it's no wonder that we're living in a remake revolution. But is it good or bad for cinema and the culture at large? We're going to be looking at this through the lens of Disney, unquestionably the biggest peddler of present-day remakes. First, let's look at the anatomy of a Disney remake. It's pretty simple. Take a massively popular Disney cartoon, make it usually live action, always with a generous dose of CGI, and an even more generous dose of celebrities. Lots of celebrities. Then, add a good, unnecessary 40 minutes of running time, usually by expanding the film's exposition, aka the introduction to its world, characters, etc. For example, the exposition in the original Cinderella clocks in at about 30 seconds. Now compare that to the exposition in the 2015 remake, which clocks in at a good 19 minutes. You can almost feel the writers struggling to pad out the story, simply because audiences these days generally prefer 2-hour-long films. And some of this narrative padding seems to be an attempt to give Disney princesses more to do than just stand around looking pretty, Which brings us to how these films adapt for modern audiences. You take whatever was perhaps objectionable about the original cartoon version, say that Cinderella and the prince fell in love after one dance because they're both hot, or that Jasmine has no discernible character arc, or that Dumbo ends with the titular character still working at the circus and PETA would protest, and then massage it to make it something a little more politically correct. Take the perplexing choice to make Gaston's sidekick LeFou pretty apparently gay for Gaston. First off, whether or not you're all about representation in film, it's an incredibly lazy effort. LeFou is pretty one-note and spends most of his time trying to talk Gaston out of wifing up.
Exactly, who needs her when you've got us?
But beyond that, it also feels a bit toothless, like an attempt to force your way into a bunch of viral headlines. After all, the gist of the story is still the same. Beauty still falls in love with the dude who held her father prisoner, then ordered her to spend the rest of her life in his creepy castle. And her ability to love him despite him not being very cute becomes irrelevant a moment later when he turns hot. These pandering attempts feel strange when compared to the obvious other option, that is, come up with some new story ideas. Ultimately, this Disney remake recipe yields a bloated version of the original film that feels uncanny and uncomfortable, like an absurdly well-funded high school play.
How would you feel about growing a beard?
Overall, these films feel like a cynical attempt to bottle millennial nostalgia in an era when adulting is particularly hard. And worse, these films are ultimately doomed to fail at doing just that. Here's why. According to film scholar Anat Zonger, the motivations of an audience watching a remake is a sort of masochistic desire to have the already known experience repeated, despite the fact that it's accompanied by the presentiment that it will never be. Basically, we walk into the theater hoping to be as wowed by Aladdin as we were the first time we saw it as kids, but at the same time, we walk in knowing that it's not going to be the same. Bummer. Still, that hope convinces us to spend good money and time watching our favorite cartoons be butchered. So what's really going on when Disney decides to remake The Lion King? According to film scholar Thomas Leach, something very specific to our cultural moment. In the past, an original film from 1931 didn't really compete with its 1943 remake, because come 1944, you couldn't access any of those films anyway. It wasn't until the mid-1950s that you could start rewatching your favorite films on TV on the couch in your underwear. But in our age of a million streaming platforms, a remake is forced into direct conflict with its original. Will you pay $2.99 to watch Beauty and the Beast on YouTube, or pay $15 to go to the theater with a vain hope that it will be better? As Leach puts it, today's remakes have to balance two opposing claims, that the remake is just like its model, and that it's better. That's why most remakes make small changes. In Cinderella, the prince and Cinderella meet up in the forest, thus hopefully easing our concerns that they fell madly in superficial love after one waltz. But these changes have to be both small enough that they don't anger audiences who love the original, and significant enough that audiences don't feel like they're watching a carbon copy. And yet, with a film as perfect as, say, Beauty and the Beast, any amount of changes, like a book that acts as a portal to the place you most want to go in the world, feels unnecessary, unwarranted, and raises a lot of weird questions about the space-time continuum. Leach goes on to explain that there are essentially 4 different types of remakes. 1. The readaptation, which just means the filmmaker went to the original source text rather than mimicking previous film versions of the story. This applies to adaptations of Shakespeare that are explicitly faithful to the text. 2. The update. This means that the filmmaker significantly changed the story, as in realigning its cultural, socioeconomic, or political meaning. Your prime example of this is West Side Story, which plants the Romeo and Juliet complex square in the middle of New York City gang wars in the late 1950s. Or the glorious update to Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew vis-a-vis 1999's classic teen flick 10 Things I Hate About You, which sets Shakespeare's story in a then present-day LA high school because why not? 3. The homage. These are movies that do not attempt to directly compete with the original film, but rather function as love letters to the original text. They also tend to establish a direct intertextual relation to the original film, that is, making direct references via inside jokes. Good examples include 80s films The Thing and Invaders from Mars, both of which openly pay homage to their 1950s predecessors. Then there's the 4th category, the true remake. True remakes essentially don't change much of anything about the original text, except by making it newer or ostensibly better. Bear in mind these categories can be slippery, but we think Disney remakes qualify as true remakes. Though they're technically live action, most rely heavily on CGI effects. The Jungle Book does entirely, making them somewhat an updated version of hand-drawn animation. According to Leach, true remakes have a curious relation with their older siblings, in that they are inherently trying to replace them. The mere existence of a live-action Beauty and the Beast can only serve to make the original animated version less relevant to modern audiences. So, could live-action Disney films, if they're really well made, ever outdo their original? Fundamentally, it seems to us like a question of visual storytelling, namely what form of narrative is most effective at conveying compelling fairy tales, and often, fairy tales prominently featuring talking animals or fantastical feats of magic. Which mouse would you rather see sew a dress? Which beast would you rather watch throw a fit? And which lion would you rather watch singing Hakuna Matata? I mean, honestly, which do you prefer? And keep in mind there's objectively only one right answer. Now, there's a legitimate argument to be made that in remaking, say, a black and white film in color, it might make the story more appealing to modern audiences. But are kids these days really that immune to the charms of 2D animation? The thing is, nobody ever complained that Disney cartoons weren't lifelike enough. And that's the only supposed problem these live-action films can really claim to solve. Disney cartoon characters evoke human feelings, even if they're lions or devils or goblins, and they do so because of the stylized artistry, not in spite of it. Charming moments where lions swing from vines aren't lifelike, and they're not trying to be. Of course, no matter how loudly we complain, facts are facts. Disney remakes make bank. Take 2017's Beauty and the Beast, which made a chill $1.264 billion in the box office, or 2019's Aladdin, which as of early July crossed the $900 million mark. The Lion King will undoubtedly ride the Beyoncé, Donald Glover, Seth Rogen, Billy Eichner fan mill to equal success. For the most part, these movies are automatic, no questions asked gold mines. Of course, there are exceptions, namely Tim Burton's steampunk Dumbo, which again, nobody asked for. But overall, these movies make a lot of people a whole lot richer. So, needless to say, Disney remakes aren't going anywhere. As of May, there were no less than 16 live-action or CGI remakes in the works, meaning that other assorted characters like Mulan, Lady and the Tramp, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame are about to get the same treatment, whether we like it or not.
Whatever, you'll pay to go see it. F you.
Now, are we categorically railing against remakes? No way. As we mentioned at the top, the roads of film history have been paved with remakes, but it goes further than that. As writer and philosopher Umberto Eco put it, the history of arts and literature is full of pseudo-remakes that were able to tell at every time something different. The whole of Shakespeare is a remake of preceding stories. For example, Romeo and Juliet borrows heavily from Ovid, a 1st century Latin poet, and his story of the similarly bummed out pair of lovers Pyramus and Thisbe. Eco thus concludes that interesting remakes can escape repetition, because seriality and repetition are not opposed to innovation. This certainly applies to movies. Indeed, sometimes a really quality remake can eclipse its original, not only in the public consciousness, but in pure quality. Take Scarface, a 1983 film so beloved in its own right, you may not have known it was a remake. To be precise, the 1983 version is an update of a 1932 film by the same name, which centers around an Italian immigrant who makes it big in the bootlegging world of Prohibition-era Chicago. The 80s version took the basic storyline but jazzed it up, centering it around a Cuban immigrant who becomes a hotshot drug lord. Here we see what feels like a warranted remake that responds to the changing social dynamics of the country's immigration patterns, while still grappling with the same themes of immorality, greed, and ambition. Here, changing the cultural context of the story wasn't a cheap shot at seeming more inclusive, a la Beauty and the Beast LeFou having an unnecessary and honestly boring crush on Gaston. Instead, it was a genuinely smart way to evolve a narrative and speak to the changing American landscape. Also, Al Pacino.
Say hello to my little friend.
Similarly, remakes can feel warranted when the technology on or off screen has changed significantly in a way that makes the film objectively more awesome. While Beauty and the Beast employed some gnarly CGI to make this candlestick talk and haunt your dreams, the technological changes did not, again in our objectively correct opinion, advance the storytelling, and actually may have hindered it. Lumiere in the original Beauty and the Beast has expressive eyebrows, big sleepy eyes, a candle wax cowlick. He is very clearly a man that was transformed into a candlestick. Lumiere in the new Beauty and the Beast looks like a creepy gold figurine your grandma keeps on the bottom row of her cupboard. In contrast, the increased capacity of practical effects in the 1980s allowed for versions of The Fly and The Thing that filmmakers could have only dreamed of in the 1950s when the originals were made. They literally advanced the storytelling by making far more believable, visceral moments. In a slightly different vein, the 2001 remake of Ocean's 11 felt justified because of all the changes in technology that the wider world had undergone since the original film debuted in 1960. Not only had weaponry and surveillance technology changed, but also cell phones happened. As such, the 2001 film has a plot and a star-studded cast better suited to the times. Then there are remakes that are celebratory love letters, pure and simple. Our favorite example of this is the 1989 film Raiders of the Lost Ark: The Adaptation, a cinematic endeavor by 3 teenagers to remake the Indiana Jones film shot for shot. Film critic Jim Windolf describes watching it with a double perspective, partly rooting for Indiana Jones to beat the Nazis, and partly rooting for the kids on screen to pull off each filmmaking feat. We'd watch this over the new Lion King any day. We set out to give you a definitive answer as to what makes a remake valuable and what makes a bona fide stinker. But as you can see, when it comes to remakes, there are a lot of fine lines, nuances, unexpected triumphs, and totally expected failures. So here's our somewhat arbitrary and totally up for debate criteria. 1. A remake often loves, or at least respects, its original. 2. A remake must advance, augment, or modernize its original in a compelling way. 3. A remake must not undo or erase what is most beloved about its original. Under this paradigm, a film like West Side Story rocks, and Disney live-action/CGI films are often stinkers in that they are explicitly untrue to the original charms that made their earlier counterparts work. So what do you guys think? Is The Lion King an abomination, or is there value in the Ford assembly line production of Disney remakes? What about remakes in general? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks to all our patrons who support the channel and our podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. But before you go, I want to give another shout out to this week's sponsor, Pedal Card. Pedal Card is a card that helps you build your credit if you're just starting out. Pedal has partnered with WebBank, a member of the FDIC, to provide people with no credit history access to a Visa credit card. Check out Pedal Card by going to pedalcard.com/wisecrack. That's pedal with a T, PETAL card.com/wisecrack to find out more. And as always, thanks for watching, guys. Peace.